Everyone, welcome and thank you so much for spending your evening with us. My name is Alison Cohen, and I am the president of Plato, the Philosophy Learning and Teaching Organization. And we are so proud and so honored to host this webinar tonight. We are very, very honored to have three special panelists with us. I will briefly introduce each of them, and then they will be speaking for about 10 minutes on a particular topic of their choosing. For those attending the webinar tonight, if you, during the course of the evening, think of a question that you would like to ask the panelists, if you could enter that in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see a button that says Q&A. And if you enter your question there, then I'll see it, and hopefully we will have time for a lot of questions towards the end of tonight's session. So thank you all so much again for joining. Like I said, we are so pleased to have with us tonight Alison Gopnik, who comes to us from the University of California, Berkeley. She is the professor of psychology, affiliate professor of philosophy, and member of the Berkeley Artificial Intelligence Research Group at the University of California, Berkeley. Alison is the author of the best-selling and critically acclaimed books, The Scientist in the Crib, The Philosophical Baby, and The Gardener and the Carpenter, a Guggenheim Fellow and Fellow of the Cognitive Science Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She writes the Mind and Matter Science column for the Wall Street Journal. We're also pleased to have with us tonight Jana Mohr, who comes to us from the University of Washington. Jana is the executive director of Plato and affiliate associate professor of philosophy at the University of Washington. Jana is the author of the book Seen and Not Heard and the Philosophical Child, and she's the co-author of the textbook Philosophy and Education, Questioning and Dialogue in Schools. She's the co-editor of Philosophy and Education, Introducing Philosophy to Young People, and author of many articles about young people's philosophical thinking. We also have with us Scott Hershovitz from the University of Michigan. He is the Thomas G. and Mabel Long Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Michigan. Scott directs the university's Law and Ethics program and co-edits the journal Legal Theory. Before joining the Michigan faculty, he served as a law clerk to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg of the United States Supreme Court. He is the author of Nasty, Brutish, and Short, Adventures in Philosophy with My Kids. He writes occasional essays on philosophy for the New York Times. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. And thank you so much for helping us to sort of get the word out about Plato and what philosophy for young kids can offer to everyone. So we'll go ahead and get started with Alison. Alison tonight will be speaking to us about what are children capable of that adults don't tend to recognize. Take it away, Alison.
Well, thank you so much. This is such a wonderful organization and a great chance to talk to all of you. So over the past 30 years, maybe now 40 years, there's just been a revolution in our understanding of children, especially young children. So if you'd asked even 30 years ago when I was in graduate school, people would have said that babies and young children were restricted to the here and now, that they just could perceive things but not think about them logically. The great philosopher John Locke said that babies were a blank slate. William James said they lived in a booming, buzzing confusion. And even Jean Piaget, who was the great founder of cognitive development, thought that children were illogical, didn't understand cause and effect, couldn't think abstractly. And it turns out that all of that is wrong. In the last 30 years, we've discovered that even the youngest children both know more and learn more than we ever would have thought was possible before. So we've learned that even the youngest children use a lot of the same kinds of techniques that scientists use to figure out about the world. So they make causal inferences. They look at data and try and draw conclusions from the data. They spend a lot of time doing experiments, although when they do experiments, we call it getting into everything. They're restlessly curious, but it's not just that they pay attention to the surface of things. They look deep below the surface to figure out things like the essences of the objects around them or the categories of the things that they see. And the general picture is so different from the picture that we used to have and that people still often have of babies and children as being somehow lesser thinkers than adults. And I think what we've discovered is that in many respects, children and babies are more profound thinkers than adults. So in my lab, for instance, we've shown that if you give participants an unlikely hypothesis, so you give them a pattern of data and there's a kind of unobvious way of thinking about it, children are actually better at solving those problems than grown-ups are, very consistently. And you can see this. I just used had this example recently. One of my they're much better at doing it than adults, and interestingly, they're much better at doing it than even state-of-the-art artificial intelligence systems are. So one of my colleagues has a 4-year-old child and was walking through the Berkeley campus. And the campus famously has a campanile. It's a big, tall clock tower, famous Berkeley campanile. And the little boy looked up at the clock tower and he said, "Mama, there's a clock. What's there?" And then he thought to himself for a minute and said, "What? Wait, wait." And then he said, "Maybe put it up high so the children wouldn't break it," which is a great hypothesis, right? Very sensible way of answering the question, but not one that a typical adult would think of. And as it turns out, not one that typical AI would think of. So when you ask that same question to something like GPT-3, which is the big powerful text system, it says there's a clock on top of the campanile because it's a campanile clock, right? So it comes up with something that's much more obvious, but much duller than the unusual and creative thing that the child is trying to solve. And finally, one of the things that we discovered back in the 80s, all the examples I've given so far are children figuring out about the physical world. We know that children are doing things like figuring out the cause and effect relationships in the physical world, or sometimes the biological world, figuring out things like the essence of species. But perhaps the most important and profound thing that children are trying to figure out is, again, a classical philosophical problem of the problem of other minds. So how do we ever know that the people around us have minds, have beliefs and desires and thoughts the same way that we do? And it turns out that that problem is a very deep problem for philosophy, but it's also a problem that even very young children are working at, thinking about, trying to solve from the time they're very young. And we can actually track the way that 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds are learning about, changing, thinking about the way that the minds of other people work. Again, this kind of classic philosophical problem. So really, for almost any philosophical topic or problem that you could think of, whether it's understanding everyday physics and causation, or understanding epistemology, understanding how knowledge works, or doing a sort of philosophy of mind, understanding what's going on in the minds of others and how the mind works, we have really good evidence that even very young children, even 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, are putting tremendous energy and intelligence into trying to solve those problems. And that they do it not just by, people sometimes talk about kids being sponges, but they do it not just by being sponges and taking in the language and discoveries of other people around them, the way that something like the artificial intelligence language system does. They do it by creating new ideas and often, startling, unusual, unlikely ideas about the answers to these profound philosophical questions about how the world works.
Great. Thank you so much, Alison. Thank you. And next up, we have Jana. And Jana is going to speak with us about examples of children's insights and strengths as demonstrated in classroom philosophy discussions. Thanks so much, Jana.
Just realized I was still muted, sorry. So I'm going to give 2 examples of classroom philosophy discussions that demonstrate how philosophically insightful children can be. But I wanted first to say a few words about children's philosophical propensities and strengths. Alison's already alluded to that. And of course, we all know that young children ask questions and wonder about the world. And in fact, for many or maybe even most people, childhood is the time of the most sustained and persistent wondering of our lives. But although we know that children are inclined to ask a lot of questions, we tend to believe they're too immature and unsophisticated to reflect seriously about complex topics. We assume they really don't understand the philosophical dimensions of the questions they pose or the statements they make. And part of it is that there's a widespread tendency to focus on children's cuteness and immaturity. So adults react to their big questions or their expressions of deep philosophical thoughts by remarking on how adorable or amusing they are. You know, kids say the darndest things, or, oh, he's so cute, or by dismissing them. Oh, she doesn't really understand what she's saying, but not by taking them seriously. And as Alison said, our perceptions of children are still largely governed by inaccurate developmental preconceptions, beliefs that we can only do certain things at certain ages. And we see children, to use her phrase, as defective adults. And as a result, we easily miss children's philosophical questions and musings because we fail to notice the profoundly serious thoughts that often underlie young children's wonderings. But they tend to be unafraid to dive into thinking about big questions. I'm frequently struck by children's willingness and ability to approach deeper questions with great candor and insight and imagination. In the first conversation I'll relate, a group of 9-year-old children proposed that there's an important relationship between choice and happiness. And I've written about both of the conversations I'll recount this evening in Seen and Not Heard, and I use pseudonyms in both of them. I'd not previously thought about choice as an element of happiness, and this made me wonder whether the connection is particularly evident to children, since the choices available to them tend to be much more limited than those available to adults. They are often less free, for example, to make such basic choices as what to eat or when to sleep. So the conversation goes like this. Emma, if you choose to do something, it will probably make you happy. If you're forced to do something, it won't make you as happy, even if you really want to do it. Joseph, I agree. Even if I like something, if I'm forced to do it, it makes me less happy. Like reading makes me happy when I can read what I want, but not if it's required, like textbooks. Laura, but if my mom tells me to eat ice cream, that would make me happy. She never does. Oscar, but if you're forced to do something, it might change your mind about whether you like it or not. Nina, I agree with that. You can end up being happy after you're forced to do something. Here's an example of that. I don't like school, but if I didn't go to school, I wouldn't be able to go to college or get a good job, and I wouldn't make the friends I'll have for the rest of my life. So school is the first step for many things that will end up with something I'm going to like, that I want to do. Hugo, yeah, you do some things you don't like because the output makes you happy. Lena, like gymnastics. It's more fun when you get better at it and get to do the harder stuff. At first, it might not make you happy, but if you keep doing it, it will. You don't always feel happy at the beginning of something that will make you happy in the end. Emma, but not getting to choose gets in the way of happiness. I like to clean my room, but when my mom tells me to do it, I don't want to do it, and doing it doesn't make me happy. Andre, happiness is a lot about choice. So Emma contends that if you're forced to do something, it won't make you as happy as even if you really want to do it, which suggests that the ability to choose is at least as important as what we're choosing. And although some studies show that too many choices might decrease happiness, certainly having some choice is important. The children point out that even if they like doing something, the task or activity makes them less happy if they didn't choose it. Oscar says, though, that there are times when you're forced to do something and it might change your mind about whether you like it or not. You might not choose to do something because you think you won't like it, but if you're forced to do it, you might find it's actually good for you and you end up happy you did it. As Nina says, although she doesn't like school, it might be the first step for many things that will end up with something she is going to like, that she wants to do. And similarly, Lena points to activities that don't necessarily make you happy when you begin them, but they turn out to make you happy if you keep at them. She reflects that, quote, you don't always feel happy at the beginning of something that will make you happy in the end. It made me think about how children are often familiar with things being hard for them, probably because they're new to many of the activities they pursue, and how difficult it can be for adults to embark on a new activity at which we don't feel particularly capable or skilled, because we're so used to being able to successfully do what we need to do. And it's harder for us to work at something that, we're not doing very well. The children's comments reveal an openness to continuing to work at things that are initially challenged, and a real awareness that fresh experiences aren't always pleasurable and don't always make us happy. The second conversation I want to relate is about death. I find it's frequently a topic that children want to discuss. They learn early in life that people die, and by the time they're 6 or so, they tend to understand death is irreversible. Some children may have dealt with the deaths of family members or friends or household pets, but most of them think of their own deaths as a long way off in the future. But death nevertheless preoccupies them. They worry that the people they love may die, and they're anxious about their own eventual deaths. Whenever I ask children, what big questions do you think about the most? Why do people die, or what happens when you die? Almost always come up. So this is a conversation with 10 and 11-year-old children. Joshua, I think people are afraid of dying, not of death. Once you're dead, you won't feel anything. People aren't afraid of that because they won't exist. So there's nothing to be afraid of. Kelsey, I think people are afraid of death. When we die, we're just dead. Your brain doesn't work anymore. It's just nothing. You don't exist. That's what makes people afraid. Andrew, I think people are afraid of death because death makes life meaningless. No matter what you do in life, someday you will die and none of it will matter. Jocelyn, but don't you think there's a difference between doing nothing your whole life and then dying, and doing something important and being remembered for what you did after you die? Andrew, not really, because eventually the people who remember you will die too. Someday no one will remember you, no matter what you do in life. Isabel, I think death doesn't make life meaningless. I think death is actually what makes life meaningful. It's death that makes you want to cherish life. If you lived forever, there would be 100% chance that eventually you would do everything you can do in life, and life wouldn't have any meaning. So what's interesting about this conversation, among other things, is it takes in such a wide range of standard philosophical views about death. Joshua says, we can't be afraid of death because it can't hurt us. We can't feel anything once we're dead. And this echoes the ancient philosopher Epicurus, who says, fear of death is irrational. When you're alive, your death isn't actual and can't affect you. Once you're dead, your death also doesn't affect you because you don't exist. But Kelsey disagrees. She says, no, we're afraid of death because we're afraid of non-existence, the thought of non-existence. And actually, many philosophers and psychologists have pointed out that there can be for many people a sort of panic generated by the thought of our own deaths, by the thought that we will no longer be. And then Andrew says, well, we're afraid of death because death makes life meaningless. Someday, no one will remember us, our lives will leave no trace, and therefore it's all pointless. And Virginia Woolf would have agreed, right? She said, the quote, the very stone one kicks with one's boot will outlast Shakespeare. But Jocelyn says, there's still a difference between doing nothing your whole life and dying, and doing something important and being remembered after you die. It's how you use the time that you have that matters, I think, is what she's saying, which echoes Camus, who says the meaning of our lives rests in the purpose we find in what we do, even if what we do ultimately is meaningless. And then, of course, Isabel says, it's not that death makes life meaningless, it's what makes life meaningful. It's knowing we will die that makes life so valuable. And the philosopher Samuel Scheffler says the most fundamental fact about our lives is that they have what he calls temporal scarcity. Our lives are finite, we might die at any time, and in the end, we will. And that's what makes life precious to us. So children have a great deal to offer, both philosophically and otherwise. And if we can listen to their thoughts and questions and ideas without thinking of them as just children, in what philosopher Gareth Matthews calls a relationship of mutual respect, we can both give them the opportunity to be heard and to see themselves as possessing unique and invaluable perspectives. And we get to connect with the special capacities present in childhood, wonder and curiosity, vibrant awareness and imagination, and a boundless sense of the possible, and help make our relationships with young people deeper and more reciprocal.
Thank you so much, Jana. Thank you. And Scott is going to talk to us about how philosophy can be part of your relationships with your children. Take it away, Scott.
Thanks. So I am a philosopher, but I come to this topic first as a father. I didn't anticipate when I had kids that they would be as philosophically interesting as they were, and also as philosophically engaged and as curious and creative as they are. And I could pile on stories to the stories that Jana offered us just from my own household. Some of the stories my kids recreated ancient arguments. My older son Rex recreated an ancient argument about the size of the universe, and then one day had the worry that goes back to Descartes and much further beyond, that he might be dreaming his entire life. And my younger son, Hank, kind of begged off a conversation about whether God exists. And it turned out his concern was that God would be angry that we were having the debate if indeed he existed, which was a worry that Blaise Pascal had, that we now call Pascal's wager. You should bet that God exists because it's in your interest to do so. They also asked really phenomenal philosophical questions. So a debate we have had in our house is my kids want to know what's wrong with swearing. Why are certain words off limits? Or when Hank was younger, he was curious about what rights are. Rex and I had really fascinating conversations about whether God exists that actually changed my view on the question, or the way that I think about God in my relationship to religion. Now, I'm in a really good position to recognize when my kids are raising philosophical questions. As Jana says, a lot of people, when they hear a kid say something like, I wonder if I'm dreaming my entire life, probably think that was a cute moment with their kids and don't connect it up to a rich tradition of thought about that kind of question. And so what I want to do is just give you some concrete advice for how you can support kids in their philosophical adventures, and advice that will be useful, I hope, even if you don't in the moment recognize that the thing that a child has just said has a philosophical history to it, that people have been discussing or debating these issues. So the simplest piece of advice I have is to talk to your kids and to ask them questions, and then to question their answers. So when I say ask them questions, what kinds of questions should you ask? Well, I think the most helpful thing that you can do sometimes is just to ask them what they're curious about. It won't always be something philosophical. It'll often be something scientific or some aspect of the social world that you'll understand and you'll be able to explain to them. But after years of banging my head against the wall, asking my kids what happened at school or what they learned that day and never getting an answer, I just started shifting to asking them, what are you curious about? What don't you understand that you wish you did understand? And we have much richer, more interesting conversations with that as a question, right? But then also, whenever any topic comes up, ask them what they think. Show that you take them seriously as a person who's thinking about things and might have views when they tell you what they think about something, whether it's why we shouldn't swear or whether God exists or whatever the topic of the day happens to be. Ask them why they think that. Invite them to give you reasons. When they get a little bit older, you can also ask them to think of reasons they might be wrong, right? And sometimes we would play a game in my house where I would assert something false, call this game counterfactual. I would assert something false, but invite them to provide the evidence that what I'd said was false. And you can do it in increasingly sophisticated ways as they get older, right? And then you can also invite them to engage in what most philosophers think of as their primary task, kind of a conceptual analysis. Ask what they mean by the words they use. So kids, for example, lots of them will use fairness as a kind of all-purpose complaint. Anything they don't like, they label unfair, but it's worth pushing them to ask them what it means for something to be unfair. And can they think of, instances of things that are fair and things that are not fair? And then I always like to ask, when I'm pressed with this complaint, whether it's my job to make things fair has led to good conversations in my house. So just asking, what is fairness? What is love? Whatever topic is under conversation, invite them to engage in the philosopher's task. And then the second bit of this is to question their answers, right? Not just to take the thing they say first at face value. So I like to say, like, Americans like to say that they're entitled to their opinion. And my kids know that in this house, nobody, not even the adults, is entitled to their opinion. You can challenge what somebody says and you can ask them to defend it. So in Nasty, Brutish, and Short, I tell the story of being out with Hank when he wanted a soda from the soda cooler at the restaurant and we said no. And he told us he had a right to decide what to drink. And I said, why do you have a right? And he said, I don't know, I just do. And I said, no, that doesn't work. If you're telling somebody that you have a right, you better supply them reasons for them to recognize that right. And sure enough, he was 7 years old. He gave me two arguments. He told me that I had a right to decide what to drink, so he should have a right to decide what to drink too. And he also told me if he got to pick his drink, that he'd be more likely to get something he liked. So I don't think these were the best arguments, and we got a chance to talk about why. But I like that he made arguments, and that he was able to push beyond the simple assertion that he had a right. So, like, where you're going to get source material for philosophical with your conversations with your kids, I think in a few ways. If you just pay attention to their complaints and their curiosities, you'll often hear a lot that you can have good conversations about. But they're really terrific resources that as a philosopher, I relied on all the time when my kids were little. So you're all obviously familiar with Plato, which has a website that is full of resources for parents and resources for teachers, games you can play, books you can read. The Prindle Institute for Ethics has a similar sort of website. They have a website called Teaching Children Philosophy, which has teaching modules for lots of the picture books that are probably on your shelves already, a primer for adults on philosophical questions that are raised, and then questions that you can ask kids as you read. And I love that as a resource, in part because my kids would ask me to read the same stories over and over and over again. And by the 20th time through a book, you'd like it to be a somewhat different experience. And if you just hop on this website and pick out a question or two that you can ask as you go through the story, you'll have a really great conversation. There's also, for slightly older kids, a really wonderful YouTube series called Wireless Philosophy. It's not targeted at kids. I think their intended audience is undergraduates, maybe, who are, or high school students who are struggling in a philosophy class or just curious about philosophy. But I've discovered that with my middle schooler, the videos are 5 to 7 minutes long. If we watch them together, we often both learn something and have good conversations. And then the last set of advice I'll give is just advice about sustaining this sort of natural curiosity that kids have. So Gareth Matthews, who Jana mentioned earlier, thought that it kind of petered out around somewhere between like age 8 and 10, when kids are becoming aware of what other people think of them and they don't want to seem silly and they're developing different sets of interests. I think it's just really important to let kids know that you value their views, that you're interested in what they have to say. Don't push them too hard. My kids, I've pushed over the years too hard. They don't want to have philosophy conversations with me so much anymore. But if I tell them that a student of mine had a question, or I heard another kid asking about something, then suddenly they come alive because they like to be helpers. So it's another way of showing that you value the kinds of questions they ask. And then the last piece of advice I got is just to pick the moments at which you do this, right? And so to try and find the times, and they're probably different in different families or different situations, when your kids are open to this kind of philosophical engagement. So sometimes when the issue comes up, you might get a minute or two's conversation out of it. But in our house, bedtime works really well. Our kids love to draw it out as long as they possibly can. So the conversation they weren't willing to have earlier in the day, they're suddenly willing to engage. That also works in the car if you're going somewhere. Like, I just toss questions into the back seat, and sometimes then the boys will have a debate without me. On a walk, just whatever it is, the moments when you can find time when they're not distracted by their own activities, that they might be willing to engage in a conversation, and then just recognize it doesn't have to last very long, and you can always return to those at the next bedtime, on the next car ride, and ask them a further question.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much. So just kind of a Q&A. I have a few questions for the panelists, but as I mentioned earlier, please feel free to ask one another questions as well. We'll save a little bit of time for that also. So the first question that I have is for Alison. And it's, you've spoken a lot about parenting and how we sort of see parenting as this goal-directed activity, right? Parents are trying to create a child that is ... And kind of speaking about thinking about parenting in a different way that isn't as goal-directed, that's more cultivating an environment in which kids can thrive and be creative and thoughtful. And I was wondering, I sort of assuming that we might have a few other teachers with us here tonight, was wondering if you think that that same observation would apply to teachers, that we sort of see teaching as this goal-directed activity, and we've sort of lost sight of the teacher as cultivating an environment that allows kids to flourish. And I was wondering if you might speak a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, I've just been doing a series of workshops, we'll have one this week, about caregiving in general. And caregiving, you know, being a parent is maybe the best example of caregiving, but it's the same thing applies to teaching, to therapy, to taking care of elders. There's many, many human activities, including some of the ones that we think are the most important and serious and morally deep in our lives, that have this quality that we're taking care of someone else. And the interesting thing is that that relationship's been sort of invisible in philosophy, and it doesn't really fit the typical frameworks that we think about in philosophy. So for example, in ethics, the great idea was the social contract. So I do something for you, you do something for me. We managed, as they say, to, you know, maximize our utilities jointly because we're involved in this contract. Or in the Kantian perspective, we have these very general principles that apply to everybody, and those are moral principles. But caregiving is completely not like that, right? So it's not that you're taking care of your kids because you think that they're going to take care of you, or that you think that they're going to reciprocate in any simple way. And the same thing's true with teachers too, right? I mean, you want the children to learn, but it's not because you think that there's going to be a kind of completely equal back and forth. And it also isn't that you want to shape them to come out a particular way. The fascinating thing about caregiving, whether it's a parent, a teacher, a therapist, even a doctor or an elder care provider, is that you want the other person to have their own autonomy. And your job is to maintain the autonomy of that other person, not to make choices for them, not even to make the choices that you think would make them happiest, let alone the ones that would make you happiest. It's this very special human capacity to make another person able to make choices for themselves. And again, if you think about what a teacher does, what even what taking care of someone who's ill, taking care of someone who's elderly, taking care of children, it all has this really special character, which, as I say, has been sort of invisible in philosophy and politics and economics. And I think we could do with paying much more attention to. And I think children are interestingly sensitive to that as well. One of the other things that I think children pretty clearly, I was just talking to a colleague who's done cross-cultural work. In most cultures, children are caregiving themselves by the time they're 9 or 10 or 11. And in our culture, we tend to, not give children those opportunities to look after younger children, for example. And I think that's a really interesting dimension. Children have real thoughts about what it means to take care of somebody else.
Yeah. And I think children have real thoughts about what it means to be in an educational environment, right? I mean, it seems to me as though the people that are making, and necessarily so, but policy decisions about what education ought to be are already kind of in this adult mindset. We're thinking the way adults think. We're not thinking the way that children think anymore, all the time. And so we don't listen to kids enough maybe about what they think about what their educational sort of environment should look like and feel like? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's just something I've been thinking about lately.
I mean, you know, there's a paradox, and in fact, I was going to say this in relation to some of what Scott was saying. I just did my latest column in the journal was exactly about this question about why it is that science tells us that children are themselves these scientists and philosophers from the time they're very little. They're kind of consumed with understanding the world at different levels. Just the thing that scientists and philosophers do, and yet by the time they get to be 8 or 9, they stop being interested in science or philosophy. And why is that? And a really interesting research program that Marjorie Rose at NYU has done is to ask children about doing science versus being a scientist. And the same thing's true about philosophy, about are you involved in the activity of doing philosophy versus do you have this special stuff that enables you to be a philosopher? And it turns out there's at every level, from little kids all the way up to graduate students, if you tell people, here's what it takes to be a philosopher or be a scientist, the implicit message is, and most of you are not going to be philosophers or scientists, or you're not the sort of person who will be a philosopher or a scientist. But if you talk to them about doing science just as an activity that everybody does, whether they're a scientist or not, or doing philosophy, then that leads to a very, very different picture. It's something that all of us are doing all the time. And there's really good empirical evidence that just that little change in language makes a difference in whether children are willing to do scientific activities later on or get engaged in science, especially women and girls and minorities who sort of don't see themselves as being in that category of being a scientist or being a philosopher.
Yeah.
So interesting, because when we go into schools, we'll say to kids, every time you think about questions like, is this person really a good friend? Or what should I do in this situation? You're doing philosophy. You're already doing it exactly in the way you describe.
Yeah. Yeah. I talked to my grandson, who's very interested in this about it. Sorry, Scott, you get to tell cute stories. We all get to tell stories about our kids. So my grandson was trying to understand what doing philosophy was. And I ended up using the slogan of the great radio program Philosophy Talk. It's where we question everything except your intelligence. And he loved that. He thought that was fantastic. The idea that you could spend your time doing in an activity where you questioned everything except your intelligence was exactly what he thought was what he wanted to do. And I think teachers will recognize that as well.
Yeah. Jana, I had kind of a more technical question for you. One of the pushbacks that I still to this day get, and you sort of alluded to this in your introductory in your talk, is that doing philosophy with kids, and I teach high school, so I teach sort of young adolescents, but with kids of all ages, that they're not developmentally prepared. Right. So it's this Kohlberg almost theory of development, right? The cognitive stages of development is so persistent. And you alluded to it, like I said in your talk, and I was wondering what advice could you give to people who were advocating for philosophy for children when they're met with that response, that kids are not developmentally capable of that kind of thinking, that it's not developmentally appropriate at a certain age?
Yeah, I mean, one thing certainly is to remind them that there are so many now examples published and online of children doing just that, right? Having these conversations that are obviously thoughtful and where they are demonstrating that they obviously understand complex philosophical ideas and concepts. So that's one piece. The other I'd say is to try your best, and this applies to philosophy, but not only, to listen to children without assuming you always know best and that you know what they're going to say. We so often finish children's sentences, assume we know what they're going to say, and don't just really listen openly in the way I think at least many of us, try to do with other adults to children and the questions they're asking. Because if you really do listen and you ask a child, as Scott mentioned, if you just say, you know, when you say that, what do you mean? Or what reason do you have for believing that? You'll be surprised with what comes back to you. So I think it really is about our attitudes primarily, because if we're willing to even just give it a try, if we're willing to throw out questions, as Scott said, or when you're reading a story with your child to say, you know, do you think this person was happy? What do you think happiness is? How do you know when someone's happy? Or whatever. You open a door for them to feel comfortable responding about what they're really thinking, because I think so often children get shut down, either, as I said, by, you know, how cute they are, or amusing, or just being dismissed. They stop expressing these ideas and questions to the adults around them. They may express them with other children, but maybe not so much with adults. And like Scott said, I mean, I think I have 3 boys, and I found with my own children that it deepened our relationships immeasurably to have these kinds of conversations, to be open to what they thought, to be willing to kind of have some give and take where sometimes I would lose the argument. That's really a powerful experience as a parent, as a grandparent, as a teacher.
Yeah, I mean, it's also worth saying that the science has really changed since Piaget and Kohlberg. And, you know, you can point to a whole lot of examples. I have some of them in my books, but you can see them in other places as well, of how the science has shown us that even these very young children are asking questions just as part of their natural cognitive capacities about other people's minds, about the nature of the world, about how knowledge works, about metaphysics of how the world works. And there's lots and lots of science that shows that this really is the natural developmental stage for children. In fact, I think you could make the argument the other way around, that it's the adults who end up being in the narrow, let's get this done, unphilosophical. That's sort of the adult developmental stage, is one where it's hard to do philosophy because you're so preoccupied with all the other things you have to do for children. That's the natural state of things, is to do things like question and wonder that are philosophical.
I would just add to that. I mean, in addition to sending these folks to Jana and Alison's books, like, to get the evidence, just the simplest thing to do is to challenge them to try it. Just pick up a picture book and a couple questions from one of the resources mentioned earlier. And it is, you know, I visited my kids' classes. I've gone to bookstores and, you know, done programs for kids where I read a picture book, and usually it doesn't take more than one question before the kids come alive and start to have a debate with each other. And they always do what they do in the stories that Jana is offering, offer sharp, insightful comments that have a real history behind them, but they've recreated them anew for themselves.
Another suggestion in terms of materials that I think is relevant to this, there's a couple of marvelous books by Stephen Law, who's actually a British writer. One is called The Philosophy Files. And more relevant to this, there's a novel called Undercover Robot that's a kind of science fiction story. And often, I think, in philosophy with children, but with adults as well, think about Plato, right? What does Plato do? He basically tells a bunch of stories, science fiction stories, as a way of raising these philosophical questions. Think about all the thought experiments that are so basic to philosophy. And that's a really good, I mean, those are things that children are very naturally engaged in and interested in. And a thought experiment, you know, what do you think would happen if you could have a brain transplant and you could put your brain in someone else? Would it still be you? Those kinds of questions about here's a story about what could happen. Those are really good ways, I think, to get kids engaged. And Undercover Robot is a marvelous kid story about the Turing test, basically. It's written in the first person by a robot who's in competition to prove that she's actually really human. And so every chapter is about what could you do if you were a robot to prove that you were human. And it's full of marvelous philosophical examples. There's also, by the way, a runaway trolley that has to be stopped. So all those examples become part of the story.
One of my favorite activities with my philosophy students, and again, I teach high school, is to ask, what questions would you ask in a Turing test, right? So how would you, what questions? And they're just fabulous. They're just great. And even though they're sort of beyond that 8 to 10-year-old age, the questions that they come up with and the way that they approach developing the question is so different from how I would ever think of answering that question. It's really kind of enlightening. So Scott, I wanted to ask you, I think one of the hesitations that parents might have in engaging in these discussions with their children, especially if they have more than one child, right? You're dealing with siblings, but for teachers as well in a classroom, is that they're hesitant to bring up these topics about rights and fairness and maybe justice, because they don't want it to get heated. Right? They're afraid of where the conversation might go. And one of the things that I always say in my class is, in this class, we make arguments, we don't have arguments. And I was wondering if you could give some advice what advice would you give to parents, and by extension to teachers, about these conversations that you've had with your children? How do you make it about making arguments and not allow it to turn into having an argument?
Yeah, so I was trying to decide if I'm opposed to them having arguments, as opposed to making arguments. I mean, so I talked about like tossing questions into the back of the car. We were driving them to camp and they were having arguments. And so I tossed out a new topic for them to have an argument about. It was, I just asked them how many holes a straw has. And instantly, Rex thought the answer was 1 and Hank thought the answer was 2. And they were making arguments, but they were also having an argument. I think that, I think it's an opportunity actually to use philosophy, especially in a classroom setting, as a way of teaching people to not necessarily not to argue, but to argue respectfully, to argue civilly. And you do it by setting norms for the conversation. I actually have to do this with my law students too. I teach a seminar here that is predominantly about abortion and euthanasia to students from a wide range of backgrounds with wide ranges of experience. And I have norms at the beginning of that class for how we're going to engage each other. And I think you can do the same thing with little kids. It's not going to be exactly the same norms, but I think we're going to take turns and we're going to listen to the person who's speaking. And if it needs to be that the person who's holding the beach ball is the person who's speaking, if some way of getting it organized, I think that can work really well. But we're going to listen to each other and maybe even setting a norm of, we're going to ask follow-up questions. We're really going to try and understand each other before we start sharing our views. So everyone needs to think of a question, right, to ask the person who is just talking. And that, and then there are norms, I guess, norms about criticizing arguments, not criticizing people is probably what you're getting at with this, make arguments, not have arguments. That, we're not going to talk to each other in ways that are disruptive for our relationships. There was a Tom Mortenberg ran a kind of program which has been copied in lots of places, where he would send his undergraduate philosophy students into schools, elementary schools, middle schools, to talk to kids about philosophy. And there was training up front for them. There's a nice PBS documentary, which I think you can still find online, about this program. There was training up front for them about how to get kids to have these conversations, and really pay attention to each other and really try and learn from each other. And I hold the what may be a fanciful hope that if this was a regular part of education, of disagreeing agreeably and really trying to understand where other people are coming from, then maybe adults in our society would have that skill more than we do.
Yes, that would be nice. That would be very nice. Jana, do you have any follow-up? You've done so much work in schools. Do you have anything that you would like to add?
I mean, I kind of echo what Scott said. I mean, I do think that part of what we want students to get from this, and children and older students, is not to be afraid to disagree. And that disagreement doesn't mean, either I'm wrong or Scott's wrong, that there's lots of different ways to see all these big questions, but that some reasons are better than others, and to learn how to evaluate reasons and to learn how to sort of take on each other's reasons in a way that's very respectful. I mean, I think that to engage honestly with someone else's view is being respectful. I mean, what's not respectful is when we don't want it, we just say, oh, whatever you think, that's, your opinion is as good as anybody else's opinion, and not really taking seriously what the other person is saying, which sometimes means saying, I don't agree with that because I think such and such. And if it's a reasoned conversation, then we can both come away. We might not change our views, but we can come away with a much deeper regard for a different way of looking at the question. And certainly that's something in our society that we probably would all agree is much needed.
Yeah. Alison, next question I have is for you. So you've spoken a lot about different kinds of intelligence, that children possess a unique sort of intelligence. And there's a trade-off that occurs in adulthood, right? And so adults think a different way. We tend to not be as much of an explorer. We tend to not be as creative. We're more goal-oriented. We're more focused on resources. We're more narrow in our focus. But you also talk about the intelligence of the elder, and the intelligence of the elder in terms of care and teaching and passing on information. And one of the things that Plato has recently been involved in, and that we're considering sort of expanding our work in this area, is this idea of intergenerational philosophy, of connecting elders with younger children and adolescents to facilitate the exchange of those different sorts of intelligences. So I was wondering if you had any advice for us as we sort of embark on this adventure of thinking about how children and elders can gain from conversations with each other.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea and a great project. And, from a biological perspective, there's two things that are really distinctive about what evolutionary biologists call life history for humans. One of them is we have this really long childhood, much longer, twice as long as our closest primate relatives. It's really unusual to have that long a period of childhood. And I've argued, and other people have argued, it's because it gives us this opportunity for learning, and especially learning in this very exploratory, wide-ranging way about many different kinds of environments before we actually have to buckle down and do things. But there's another piece of that story, which is that we have this 20 years after menopause for women, and always have since we were foragers, which is also very unusual, where we're living, we're doing things, but we're not actually reproducing ourselves anymore. And there's a really interesting puzzle about why is that? Why is there that extra 20 years? By the time chimps are about 50 and reach menopause, their lifespan is over. And the idea that I've been arguing in others is that there's this real synergy between having the children who have this long period where they're just devoted to learning, and then having the elders who are the ones who've learned a lot about how the world works, and who aren't as preoccupied with, finding mates and resources and their place in the dominance hierarchy, but who can pass that information on. Interestingly, the only other mammal we know of that has this postmenopausal grandmother period are orcas. And it turns out that orca grandmothers actually pass on information about what they found out about foraging. They're also one of the few cultural species. So that elder-child relationship really seems to play a really important role in cultural transmission, which is one of the really distinctive things about humans. And of course, in our culture, we tend to separate out. We put all the children off in school, and we put all the parents off in Florida, the grandparents off in Florida. We don't have that kind of interaction. But in most cultures, there's a marvelous study that I love by the anthropologist Polly Wiesner. And what she did was she just did an analysis in this forager group of what people said at various points during the day. If you have 5 people together, what are they talking about? And what she discovered was that if you look during the day, it was mostly, you know, the 35-year-olds who were talking, and they were mostly talking about how to get things done. Something like 60% was complaining about the fact that everybody else was not doing the thing that they were supposed to be doing, which I find rather comforting, actually. You know, I come home and tell my husband, oh, it was only, you know, like 60% complaint today. That was a good day. But here's the interesting thing. At night, when you sat around the fire, and of course, fire is a really distinctively human ability too, suddenly it shifted. Now it was the elders who were talking and the little kids who were listening around the fire. And the elders weren't talking about what are we going to do today? How do we arrange this? They were telling myths. They were telling stories. They were giving the big, wide parameters of what the culture was about and what was important. And they were doing philosophy. They were, you know, talking about things like what made something ethical or not, or what was a good thing to do, or what was a bad thing to do, or talking about religious ideas about the way that the world worked. And I think there's something about, you know, there's something about those relationships between grandparents and grandchildren where grandparents have this kind of, you know, the kind of long vision, right? You know, they've been there before, they know about what happened a long time ago, and they know about the big parameters of the world, not just the details. And they're really seem to be very, very well designed to pass that on to children. This may be a complete just so story, but I like the idea that, you know, of course, remembering what happened yesterday, right? That's the kids already know about that. So if you can't remember what happened yesterday, it's not a big deal. But remembering what happened when you were a little girl, I discovered I was just looking after my 2-year-old grandson, and I discovered that I kept singing Broadway show tunes, which I would not have thought was a big part of my personality or culture, but somehow automatically, if you're a grandmother, you pass on the songs from 50 years ago from your youth. So I think this is a fabulous idea, and I think there's a lot of reason to believe that in most places and times and cultures, it really was the elders who get a break from the immediate resources, who are in a sense doing philosophy and passing on philosophical thoughts and interacting with young kids in this kind of philosophical way.
I wonder too, it seems like some of that is about time, right? That the elders and the children have the time to spend on these more expansive questions, as you put it. Whereas the, you know, people who are in their 30s and 40s or whatever are busy just trying to do everything they need to do to get through the day and to take care of the people they're taking care of.
Yeah. I mean, what I say sometimes, perhaps a little unfairly, is that basically we're human up till puberty and after menopause. And then in between, we're sort of these glorified mammals who have to go and do all the things that mammals do about getting mates and resources and finding their way in the pecking order. Now, having just spent time with my 35-year-old children, I think that's maybe a little unfair, because those poor 35-year-olds, they really have it rough compared to the kids and the grandparents who get to, you know, partly because we're useless, right? I mean, we're not really great at getting resources or mates anymore. We can put all of our time and energy into doing philosophy. And that's a bit of a joke, but not entirely. I mean, I do think there's good evidence that we have these different stages of human development with different kinds of capacities, and the children and the elders are really a wonderful kind of combination to allow things like cultural transmission, discovery, change, dealing with new environments to happen.
Great. I wanted to open up and offer our panelists the opportunity to ask one another questions. Are there any questions that you have for another panelist? If not, I have several questions from our viewers tonight. Okay, so this is one I found.
I do have one question. Yeah. I have a question for Alison, which is, do you think that, I mean, there's such a distinct experience being a young child and such a distinct experience being a grandparent or an elder. But are there ways in which, besides the time issue that we just talked about, and the sort of, that you can think about? I mean, it seems like both groups in some ways are on the periphery.
Right.
So I'm curious to know if you've thought about this and what you might say.
Yeah, as I say, I mean, it's a bit of an irony, right? Because people don't pay any attention to either children or elders, right? Especially in our society. In most societies, elders get more attention and respect than they do in ours. But especially in ours, it's like they're kind of invisible around the edges. And yet what I think the science would tell us is that they're doing a lot of this really serious, important work, and work that we think is very much part of our human capacities. Now, something that's really interesting that's come up recently is, let me see if I can quickly describe this. You were mentioning before about exploring versus exploiting. So the idea is that there's this real tension between just looking at the world widely, thinking about it as widely as you can, the kinds of things that we do. You know, philosophy is sort of the ultimate explore activity. And then exploit, which is actually doing things that are useful, that will bring about good things in the world, which of course is a very important thing that we have to do. Now, that exploit capacity, sometimes you can think of as executive function, is the way people describe it. And you can even show in your brain that, you know, your prefrontal lobes come in and control a lot of what else is going on in your brain, designed to do things like have goals and try to accomplish goals and have utilities, do the things that you want and get them done. The Buddhists describe this as being sort of Maya, right? Or people describe it as being on the hedonic treadmill, where, you know, you get something and then you work really hard to get it. And then as soon as you get it, you decide, no, I want something else. And kids and grandparents really seem to kind of get off the hedonic treadmill. So there's quite a bit of evidence that in spite of the fact that, you know, we get creaky and tired and sick, elders are happier. When you reach that elder period, very, very consistently, people report more life satisfaction. And I think it's because both the children and the elders are not in that, you know, on that hedonic treadmill anymore. And there's some evidence that if you look at different kinds of measures and tests, there's at least some of them where both the children and the elders do better than regular adults. So for example, you have a test where you'd want to see if someone pays attention to something that isn't actually the focus of a goal they have. And the children and the elders do better at noticing something out in the periphery that isn't the thing that they were supposed to notice in the first place. So there's some real similarities between the way that the elders and the kids are functioning, which I think is because the kids have not yet, and the elders have gotten over that kind of being in the grip of goals and desires that's so characteristic of being a regular adult.
Yeah, that makes me think about, I've been wanting to ask you, Scott, this question. It makes me think about how, when I would talk to my children when they were young about these big questions, how often it would kind of take me aback that the way they looked at something was so different and so surprising, and changed how I saw things. And I'm curious to know if you have a story about something you've learned from your children.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier these conversations that Rex and I had starting when he was 4 about whether God existed. We sent him to the Jewish Community Center preschool, and he would learn lots of stories about God, and he would come home, and this was one of his main curiosities for a while. And I would just reflect the question back to him. So one night I'm cooking dinner and he says, is God real? And I said, what do you think? And he said, I think that for real, God is pretend, and for pretend, God is real. And it came out that crisp, and I was just kind of stunned by it. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I think that God isn't real, but when we pretend he is. And that happened 8 years ago. And I've been thinking about it ever since, because it really, it helped me think my relationship to religion differently. So I don't think of myself as a believer in God. I don't think the stories that he's learning in religious school are true. But nevertheless, religion plays a significant part in my life. Rex is studying for his bar mitzvah now, and we go to synagogue and we observe holidays. I fast on Yom Kippur and I keep Passover. And I've always sort of in the back of my mind wondered, why is it that these things are important to me if I lack the metaphysical commitments that lurk behind them? And Rex helped me just see it in a whole new way, helped me think of religion as a kind of pretend play. So philosophers have a name for the kind of view that Rex articulated when he said, God isn't real, but when we pretend he is. They call that fictionalism. Things can be not real in our actual world, but real in fictions. And I came to like appreciate that all the things that religion contributes to my life as a kind of pretend play, that it gives me a kind of structure through the year for getting together with family and having observances, but then also through a life cycle. And it connects me to a tradition that I value. And so I came to understand myself better and my relationship to religion better just through that conversation with a 4-year-old.
Scott, can I ask a follow-up question to that? So your day job, right? You're a professor of law, professor of philosophy. I'm wondering, in addition to the religious example that you just gave, if you could think of an example of where a conversation with your kids has added to your understanding of your academic life, like a question that you consider in your, so it's something that you would consider yourself well-versed in. You did the school, you did the degrees, yep. You did all of that stuff. And then one of your kids says something and you're thinking about this topic that you are an expert in an entirely different way.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm full of those. My book was born out of the fact that I was constantly taking the things my kids said to class and saying, or the things they did, right? So like one of my kids misbehaved and like, I teach about punishment a lot. I might start my class with, let me tell you what Rex did last night. And how do you think I should have responded? And that's what's going to get a conversation about the purposes of punishment going. But there was one particular morning when Hank was 3 years old. He was in preschool and he had the day off. So we were kind of playing around. And then all of a sudden he says to me, Caden, a kid in his class, called me a floofer-doofer. And then Kelly, the teacher, came to talk to me. That's a mysterious sentence. And so like I keep trying to pick apart this story to understand what happened. And it becomes quite clear that the teacher came to talk to Hank because he'd taken revenge in some fashion. And I could never get him to tell me what he'd done. It couldn't have been that bad because we didn't get like a report home from the school, but he'd struck back in some fashion. And though I couldn't get him to tell me what he'd done, I asked him, Hank, did you think it was okay to do something mean to Caden because he did something mean to you? And he looked at me like I was the stupidest person in the world and said, yes, he called me a floofer-doofer. And so, I teach about punishment and righting wrongs. I teach tort law. And that got me thinking, like, what is it that struck Hank in that moment? That just being like, someone's wronged me. The thing for me to do is to respond in kind and to strike back at them. And to think about what is it that he was trying to get. He wasn't very articulate about it, but I think that he was trying to stand up for himself to show that he wasn't a floofer-doofer, that he wasn't the kind of kid most centrally that could be called one. And actually, like there's a chapter in about revenge in my book, kind of set me off running, thinking, what is it that people really want when they've been wronged? Why does revenge seem to provide it for them? And then once you have an answer to that, you might ask, what are substitutes that don't put people's physical safety at risk, that might offer some of the things people are hoping to get when they take revenge?
Yeah. And the reason I ask that is because not all academic philosophers, but we still get pushback from some academic philosophers who just can't fathom that a kid, an adolescent, a child would have something to add to a philosophical question that they have been pondering in an academic sense their entire professional career, right? There's no way that an 8-year-old could add anything to this topic that I have a PhD in. And I just think that's a great example of how, if we're just open to the epistemic value that that children have or can contribute, there's a lot for us to gain as well, right? I mean, there's a lot that we can add to our own professional insights. So thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And that kind of, I'm going to switch a little bit to the viewers' questions. And there's one question that sort of feeds off of that, and it's this. A question, does the method, and this is for all three of you, I think all three of you might have something to contribute to this. Does the method in which you teach philosophy to kids change as they age? For example, shifts in attitudes, content, and classroom setting.
Well, I think one interesting thing is that as children are developing, the kinds of things that they're really interested in is really a good index of where they're learning the most. So if you're talking about a 3 or 4 year old, you know, they're incredibly fascinated by theory of mind, by what people think, by what people want. Why do people want different things? Why is it that they eat snails in France, right? Or why is it that mama likes to drink kirsch and it tastes terrible as far as the child's concerned? And then gradually, as they get through the school age period, they get more and more interested in societies. So instead of having imaginary friends, my grandson, who's 11, showed up with these incredibly elaborate maps of this game that he and his friends are playing. They're called paracosms, where you're inventing an alternate reality, an alternate society, an alternate government. And children very spontaneously, you know, the famous examples are like the Brontes are writers, but 10, 11-year-old children will just do this very spontaneously. They don't share it with their parents quite as much, but if you go to the schoolyard, you can see a lot of it. And they start being interested in peer relationships. One of the things I say sometimes, you know, I've had teachers who say, well, how come, you know, the middle school kids just don't care about any of this stuff that you keep saying they're really interested in? And I say, do they care about who likes who? And then the teacher will say, oh yeah, they will never stop talking about that, right? It's really tough. It means like we can't get them into school, into real thinking, because all they do is talk about who's the allies and who's the enemies and who likes who in the schoolyard. But of course, that's more like what we do when we think about law and ethics. So I think you can kind of track what children are interested in. And often adolescents, we mentioned about death, for instance. There's really lovely work by Susan Carey that suggests that around age 6, there's this sudden revelation about the fact that death is actually death. It's not just that grandma goes to another place, it's really irreversible. And often that's like an existential crisis for a 6 or 7 year old. They really get shaken by that and want to figure out how it works. For adolescents, realizing, who are so interested in societies, realizing that social norms could be different, is something that's a real focus of attention. You know, are these norms that I've been internalizing for so long, they could be up for grabs. So I think, you know, the things that kids are interested in are good indicators of where they're learning the most and where they're thinking the most.
I'll just add to that. So I mentioned Rex is in middle school now, and we have had an ongoing conversation this year about what is popularity. When you say these are the popular kids, right? Like, things that are like causal maybe of your being popular, but it's really hard to say because it's not being well known. You know, right. Like you could be well known and not popular. He's really interested in that question. And it turns out actually lots of people are really interested in that question. That's my latest cocktail party question. But finding the thing that gets them excited, it changes over time. But I actually think like good teaching often involves the same thing at every age. It's finding a way to connect it to their lives or to connect it to a story that they find interesting or engaging. And that works with 3-year-olds and it works with 3-year-olds.
Yeah, I should say, you know, we have this tendency. So, you know, have things like Marvel movies, right? Which I think some of us will roll our eyes at the number of hours that we spend watching Marvel movies with our middle schoolers. But there's a lot of philosophy in those Marvel movies. There's a lot of thinking and talking about multiverses and what counts as being good or bad. And I do think that's part of the reason why children are getting so captivated by them.
Great. So we have another question from an audience member. It says, I'm a high school teacher, and one of the pushbacks I get is that the topics that we talk about, ethics, religion, are parenting responsibilities, not a teacher's responsibility. Yet, of course, many kids don't get these discussions at home. They walk around with unresolved thoughts and feelings about big ideas with no forum in which to share them. So we said, not really a question, just an observation, but I was wondering if three of you would want to comment on that. The topics that we talk about in philosophy, I think, are sometimes questioned as not appropriate topics for a school setting.
I think that sometimes what's really underlies that is a fear that the students are being indoctrinated in a particular way, so that there's a particular point of view that the teacher is teaching. And I mean, we get sometimes, what kind of philosophy are you teaching? We always say, well, we're actually not teaching philosophy at all. We're just doing philosophy with the students. And I think, and often when I've had over the years parents who've been, I've been going into a classroom and they've been concerned, and I always invite them to come and observe, because what's really going on is very similar to what both Scott and Alison just said, which is we're really trying to follow the conversation where the students want to take it, where their interests lie, and we're not there to provide a particular set of content about, this is what you should learn from ethics, or this is how you should live your life, etc. So I think and part of this is that our society is very philosophically uneducated because we don't get philosophy early in life. And so for many people, they hear philosophy or they hear ethics and they think, this is going to be, my kid's going to come home with very different ideas than what how we want them to live. And I think that's a valid concern, but I think it misconstrues what this is really about, which isn't about providing the students with a certain way to think. It's giving them space to think for themselves.
So one other question, and I'm not familiar with this work, but maybe the three of you are. So someone observed that this discussion got them thinking about the work on slow and fast thinking. And they were wondering if anyone could comment on that and possible sort of intersections.
Yeah, this is like Danny Kahneman's work, making a contrast between the sort of intuitive, unconscious ways that our minds work and that lead us to act in the ways that we do. And then the sort of slower, more reflective, more rational kind of thought. And again, for a long time, people have said sort of put kids in the first category, right? They're just acting on instinct. They're doing it without really thinking through it. They're just unconsciously going around and intuitively acting in the world. And of course, kids are, as indeed are adults. But I think one of the really interesting things is that if you just look at, if you just look at transcripts of children's spontaneous conversation, not even in a philosophy class, there's a marvelous thing called Childes, which is a big database of just children's language that linguists collected. You find this kind of thoughtful going through a question, looking for an answer. Henry Wellman's book, Children Talk About the Mind, and he has a more recent book, Making Minds, as well, just is full of these examples of children not just doing the intuitive thing, actually asking a question, waiting for an answer. Excuse me. And one of the things that Henry showed empirically is that children are very sensitive to the quality of the answers they get. So if they think that the answer is just kind of pat, this speaks to what Jana was saying, they'll keep asking, at least the little ones, and for a while we'll keep asking that why question until they get something that actually sounds like it's a reasonable answer to that question. I wanted to mention something also that I really love that I think is relevant to this discussion, going back to the being a philosopher versus doing philosophy. One of the studies that came out showed that places like philosophy often think there's kind of this intrinsic quality to being a philosopher. Like either you have the gift of being a philosopher or you don't have the gift of being a philosopher. And the more that's true in a discipline, the less likely women are, for example, to be part of the discipline. And women are, of course, have always been underrepresented in philosophy. And I was talking about this with Anthony Appia, who's a great philosopher. And he said something I thought was really wonderful, which is philosophy of all things is something where people who are completely different kinds of thinkers you can think a million different ways. And those different ways of thinking are all going to be relevant to philosophy, are all going to be ways of answering philosophy. Philosophy is a place where you don't want people who think the same way or who have a gift or who have a particular kind of mind. Philosophy is a place where you want people with as many different kinds of minds and different ways of thinking as you possibly can have. And of course, once he said that, it seemed so obvious, but I think it's not something that we have as a picture of either sort of professional philosophy or, say, philosophy in the schools. We tend to think of it as this kind of very specialized thing that only people who function a particular kind of way can do, as opposed to, and I think this speaks to the question about the parents as well, as opposed to, oh no, this is just thinking about these things is something that everybody does.
Yeah, it's actually, I think, can be really humbling, especially for a professional philosopher to do philosophy with kids or just to pay attention to kids' conversations. Because, like, just think about the conversation that Jana shared about death. As she observed, it recapitulates like much of the philosophical thought that people have about death. And that's just true in so many areas of philosophy. And, you know, I think it's kind of released me from my anxiety of influence. Like have I done something in this field that's really going to change the way people think? Because there are really very few new ideas to have, wholly new ideas. And children are not just capable of having the famous ideas. They're probably more likely than any of us, I think, to come up with truly different perspectives on the world.
Do you think it's partly because we think of the philosopher as hyper rational, right? They're this hyper rational thinker, and we think of children as sort of maybe not the most rational of beings, and that sometimes in sort of juxtaposition to one another, as opposed to thinking of philosophy more in terms of questioning, right? And this whole sort of exploration and discovery that we associate with childhood.
Well, and
There's
I think we
great...
sorry. I was going to say, I think we undervalue the role of imagination in philosophy. And when we think about how important imagination is, when we think about, you know, come up with thought experiments or try to see a question in a wholly new way, children, as Alison points out, are generally way better at that than adults. And so I think it's this picture we have of philosophy that is part of the problem. And then part of the problem is a picture we have of children as being unable to be rational and to take, you know, to think carefully about these subjects, which of course we all at least think is incorrect. Sorry, Scott, go ahead.
No. I was just going to, there's this famous line from David Hills, who teaches at Stanford, who described philosophy as the ungainly attempt to answer the questions that come naturally to children with the methods that come naturally to lawyers, which kind of like captures who I am in the world very well. But I think it's important to know that, like, philosophy doesn't have to be the thing that professional philosophers are doing. It doesn't have to use the methods that come naturally to lawyers of 30 pages of sustained argument with premises and conclusions. And it's not that I don't think there's value in that register of doing things, but actually one sort of crisis in philosophy is that way of doing things is often inaccessible to a large fraction of the population that's curious about these questions and maybe needs the insights that philosophers are having, but the contemporary philosophy is written in a way that's not available to them. And so I think, Hills is describing what professional philosophers do, but it's important to remember that's not all that philosophy is or should be.
Yeah, I have one of my colleagues, Clark Mohr, was a famous philosopher of science, said that when he did his philosophy exams, he said, look, what counts isn't the arguments, it's a picture. It's, do you have a big picture of what the answer to this question is? And he actually got his students to just draw a picture about what you think the relationship is between data and evidence, or the relationship is between the world and your knowledge of the world. And of course, that kind of pictures and stories, that's what kids are very naturally engaged in doing. And there's an argument that, if you really want to talk about what's Plato's contribution or Kant's contribution or any of the great philosophers or Descartes' contribution, it's really a picture. It's an idea about what the world is like, more than here's a whole bunch of you know, rational, knock 'em dead, lawyerly arguments in favor of the picture.
It's just a couple of things I wanted to follow up on. So someone asked if we could repeat something. You said you're not teaching philosophy, we're doing philosophy. Jana, do I have that correct? I just want to, yeah. So we're not teaching philosophy, right? We're not teaching a particular perspective or viewpoint. We're engaging students with philosophy. We're doing philosophy. And then there were a couple of people, which I'm very excited about, who were interested in becoming more involved in Plato. So they either have children or they themselves are part of a book group. There are a few different sort of stories on here. And yeah, so two things that I'll just say real quick. Number one, please visit our website. Please visit our website. We have a lot of resources on the website, including a toolkit that has a lot of these, you know, sort of discussion prompts that we've been talking about tonight. And also it has our email, more importantly. So please, please feel free to reach out and email us and let us know that you're interested in becoming more involved in Plato, and we will have someone respond to you pretty quickly. And so I think, oh, and then one person, Scott, asked if you could just sort of list the websites that you recommended. They missed the first couple, sure. And they just, yeah.
Okay, so well, first the Plato website. And then after that, if you just Google teaching children philosophy, it will take you to the website that the Prindle Institute for Ethics runs. And then the third is there's a YouTube series called Wireless Philosophy. I think they abbreviate it Wi-Fi, WI-PHI. But they have their, I think all the videos are hosted on YouTube. They also have their own website that will help you find things by topic.
And I should say that both Prindle and Wi-Fi, as well as a lot of other resources, are in the links on the Plato site. So there's probably a dozen or so sites that are really useful for both teachers and family members.
Yeah, or someone who is part of a book club.
Which or someone who's part of a book club, absolutely.
Fantastic.
Yeah, you know, I think it's worth mentioning that some of the greatest philosophers, like Descartes or Hume, weren't professional philosophers. They didn't have academic philosophy degrees. They were curious people out there in the world trying to think and do things, and, you know, going to book groups, right? That was, those coffee houses were sort of the equivalent of book groups. So you're in a great philosophical tradition by doing that.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to the three of you for joining us tonight. Like I said, Plato is so happy to sponsor this webinar, and it's been so enjoyable to hear your thoughts on these questions. And one more time, I would just encourage everyone to take a look at the website and reach out to us if you are interested in becoming more involved in Plato and the work that Plato does in bringing philosophy to young kids. And as I mentioned, maybe our new endeavor of connecting elders and children, which we're super excited about. So thank you so much, Alison and Scott and Jana, and to everyone else who joined us this evening. It is my pleasure to say good night.
Night.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.